is seeing historic success in the Everglades.
As Fox 35's Carla Byron explains, it's helping to remove Burmese pythons from the wild in record numbers.
There are moments in history when the most controversial decision turns out to be the most brilliant one. Florida had one of those moments, and almost nobody recognized it at the time. When state wildlife officials announced they were releasing thousands of a particular native creature back into the wild specifically to help combat one of the worst invasive species disasters in American history, the reaction was immediate and brutal. People laughed. Social media exploded with ridicule. News anchors raised their eyebrows on live television. Late-night jokes wrote themselves. How could releasing more animals into an already overwhelmed ecosystem possibly be the answer? But behind that laughter was a crisis so severe, so deeply embedded in Florida's landscape, that conventional solutions had completely and utterly failed. What Florida did next would eventually silence every critic, and the truth of what has happened since is more remarkable than anyone dared to imagine. To understand why this decision was made, you have to go back to where the disaster truly began. The Florida Everglades is one of the most unique ecosystems on the planet. Stretching across nearly 1.5 million acres of subtropical wetlands, sawgrass prairies, and dense mangrove forests in southern Florida, it has long been recognized as an irreplaceable natural treasure. The U.S. government designated it a UNESCO World Heritage Site, an International Biosphere Reserve, and a wetland of international importance. It provides drinking water for millions of Floridians, supports enormous biodiversity, drives significant tourism revenue, and acts as a natural buffer against storms and flooding. It is, in every measurable sense, one of the most ecologically important places in North America. For decades, however, something had been quietly devouring it from the inside. The Burmese python, native to the jungles of Southeast Asia, arrived in Florida through a combination of the exotic pet trade and disaster. These snakes were imported by the thousands throughout the 1980s and 1990s as novelty pets. Young pythons are relatively manageable in size, but adults regularly grow to 13 or 14 feet and can exceed 200 pounds. When owners could no longer handle them, many simply released them into nearby wild areas, particularly in and around Miami. Hurricane Andrew in 1992 also contributed to the problem when it destroyed a python breeding facility near Homestead, releasing an unknown number of snakes directly into the wild. For years, the situation was treated as a curiosity rather than a catastrophe. That attitude was a deadly mistake. By the 2000s, the Burmese python had established a self-sustaining wild population in South Florida. By the 2010s, the scale of the problem had become undeniable. Scientific surveys conducted by the U.S. Geological Survey and other research institutions documented some of the most alarming wildlife population declines ever recorded in North America. Marsh rabbit populations in Everglades National Park had declined by nearly 100% in areas with confirmed python presence. Raccoon populations dropped by 99.3% in some surveyed zones. Possums fell by 98.9%. Bobcat sightings declined by 87.5%. White-tailed deer populations in certain areas plummeted by more than 94%. The data was non-ambiguous. The Burmese python was functioning as an apex predator in an ecosystem that had no evolutionary history with it, no instinctive fear of it, and no natural mechanisms to limit its spread. It was consuming entire food chains from the bottom up, and the silence left behind was the silence of ecological collapse. Current estimates from the U.S. Geological Survey and the South Florida Water Management District place the wild python population somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 individuals, though the actual number is genuinely unknown due to the near impossibility of detecting these animals in dense vegetation. Female Burmese pythons can lay between 50 and 100 eggs per clutch, and they provide maternal brooding that significantly increases hatch rates. In Florida's warm, humid climate, with an abundant food supply and zero natural predators capable of controlling them, the population dynamics were almost entirely in the snake's favor. Florida's response to this crisis was aggressive and sustained, but the results were humbling. The state launched the Florida Python Challenge, an annual competition-style removal event that drew hunters from across the country. The 2024 event brought in hundreds of participants who collectively removed 195 pythons. The 2025 event set a new record with 294 snakes removed over the competition period. These numbers generated significant media attention, but wildlife biologists were clear-eyed about what they represented. If the wild population numbers even 100,000 snakes, removing 294 represents less than 1/3 of 1% of the total. The South Florida Water Management District employs a dedicated team of contracted python removal specialists who work year-round using advanced detection methods, including radio-tagged scout snakes that lead researchers to breeding aggregations. Since 2017, these combined efforts have removed over 23,000 pythons from the wild. By the agency's own estimates, this still represents roughly 1% of the total population. Every python removed is a genuine conservation contribution, but removal alone was never going to solve the problem. The math simply did not work. It was within this context of mounting frustration and ecological desperation that a different kind of solution began taking shape, one rooted not in extraction but in restoration. The eastern indigo snake, known scientifically as Trimarching cooperi, is the longest native snake species in North America. Adults commonly reach 7 to 8 feet in length, with some individuals exceeding 9 feet. The species is entirely non-venomous and poses no meaningful threat to humans. What makes it ecologically remarkable, however, is its dietary range and its fearlessness. Eastern indigo snakes are ophiophagus, meaning they eat other snakes, including species significantly larger than their own head. They consume venomous pit vipers such as rattlesnakes and cottonmouths without hesitation and without apparent risk, possessing a natural resistance to the venom of native species. They pin their prey and swallow it alive, using speed and strength rather than constriction. Researchers have documented individual indigo snakes consuming multiple other snakes in a single day. In the ecosystem context of the Everglades and the broader Florida landscape, this made the species a theoretically powerful counterweight to the python invasion. There was only one problem: the eastern indigo snake had nearly disappeared from its entire native range. Once found across the coastal plain states from North Carolina south through Florida and west into Mississippi, the species experienced catastrophic population declines throughout the 20th century. Habitat loss from the conversion of longleaf pine ecosystems to agriculture and urban development destroyed the ancient forests the indigo depended on. The longleaf pine ecosystem, which once covered approximately 90 million acres across the American Southeast, has been reduced to roughly 3% of its original extent, one of the most severe habitat destructions of any ecosystem in North American history. The eastern indigo snake was also heavily collected for the pet trade due to its striking iridescent blue-black coloration and docile temperament toward humans. Perhaps most devastatingly, the species relies heavily on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter, nesting, and thermoregulation. When gopher tortoise populations declined due to habitat loss and direct human exploitation, the indigo snake lost one of its most critical resources. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service listed the eastern indigo snake as a federally threatened species in 1978. By the early 2000s, the wild population in Florida was a shadow of what it had once been, with documented breeding populations confined to scattered preserves and protected lands. The effort to bring it back began not with fanfare but with years of quiet, methodical science. Researchers at the Orion Society, working in partnership with the Central Florida Zoo and Botanical Gardens, the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, and multiple state and federal wildlife agencies, developed a captive breeding program with the explicit long-term goal of restoring self-sustaining wild populations. The program involved carefully selecting genetically diverse breeding pairs, raising hatchlings in large naturalistic enclosures designed to preserve wild behavioral instincts, and conducting what biologists call soft releases, where snakes are gradually acclimated to a release site before being fully set free. This was not a rushed or improvised response. It was a structured, peer-reviewed conservation effort that had been years in development before the first snake ever touched wild soil. Beginning in 2010, reintroduction efforts began at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve in the Florida Panhandle, a site managed by the Nature Conservancy that contains significant tracts of restored longleaf pine habitat and healthy gopher tortoise populations. Over the following years, additional releases took place at other protected sites across North Florida and into Alabama. By 2025, more than 500 eastern indigo snakes had been released across their historic range, with monitoring programs tracking their movements, health, and reproductive activity through radio telemetry and camera traps. When the public announcement about the releases gained wide media attention, the reaction was exactly what scientists had privately dreaded. The immediate cultural association was with Florida's already notorious reputation for unusual wildlife situations, and the concept of releasing large snakes into a state already struggling with a snake invasion struck many people as either irresponsible or absurd. Critics compared it to the mongoose introduction in Hawaii during the 1880s, when sugar plantation owners imported Indian mongooses to control rats, only to discover that mongooses are diurnal while rats are largely nocturnal, meaning the two species rarely encountered each other. Instead, the mongooses decimated ground-nesting bird populations and caused damage to native wildlife that persists to this day. It was a fair historical reference, and it reflected a genuine scientific concern about the risks of biological introductions, even of native species. But the comparison missed something fundamental. The eastern indigo snake was not being introduced. It was being restored. It had lived in these ecosystems for millions of years. The food webs, the habitat structures, the ecological relationships it participated in were not novel. They were ancient. Then came the evidence that changed everything. In the autumn of 2023, trail cameras at the Apalachicola Bluffs and Ravines Preserve captured images of two wild-born eastern indigo snake hatchlings, the offspring of previously released individuals. One of the hatchlings bore no identification tag, confirming it had been born entirely outside of human involvement. For the first time in nearly 50 years, the eastern indigo snake had reproduced in the wild in North Florida. Wildlife biologists who had spent years on this project described the moment as deeply emotional. It was not just proof that the snakes were surviving. It was proof that they were behaving as wild animals, finding mates, selecting nest sites, and successfully raising the next generation in restored habitat without human assistance. The project had crossed a threshold that many in the conservation community had privately doubted it would ever reach. Subsequent monitoring through 2024 and into 2025 continued to build the picture of a genuine recovery. Multiple snakes from earlier release cohorts were relocated and confirmed to be in healthy condition and actively using their habitat. A large male was documented traveling considerable distances through restored longleaf pine scrub, behavior consistent with natural territorial ranging. A female released in 2019 was still alive, healthy, and active 6 years after her release, an enormously encouraging sign for population sustainability. In Alabama, 44 additional snakes were released in 2025, expanding the geographic footprint of the recovery effort and adding to the growing body of evidence that the program was working. Simultaneously, field observations in South Florida began documenting something that added an entirely different dimension to the story. Eastern indigo snakes released or naturally present in areas near the python invasion zone were being documented preying on juvenile Burmese pythons. Juvenile pythons, typically less than 2 feet long in their first season, fall well within the prey range of a large indigo snake. These encounters were not staged or engineered. They were wild predation events captured on camera traps or witnessed by field researchers, representing exactly the kind of natural predator-prey dynamic that conservation biologists had theorized but not yet confirmed at scale. Alligators were also documented consuming younger pythons. Native bobcats, whose populations had been devastated by the invasion, were filmed successfully attacking and killing pythons under certain conditions. The Everglades, after years of silent collapse, was beginning to show the early, fragile signals of ecological counterbalance. Nobody in the scientific community is claiming that the eastern indigo snake will eliminate the Burmese python problem. That is not what this is about. The python population is too large, too entrenched, and too reproductively prolific for any single countermeasure to dismantle it. What the indigo snake reintroduction represents is something more nuanced and more meaningful, the partial restoration of a functional ecosystem. Apex predators do not just kill prey. They change the behavior of prey species, redistribute animal populations across a landscape, and create cascading effects that stabilize entire ecological communities. The reintroduction of the eastern indigo snake into restored longleaf pine habitat, and its gradual spread into adjacent ecosystems, is one component of a broader strategy that includes active python removal, continued habitat restoration, gopher tortoise protection, and ongoing scientific monitoring. No single piece of this strategy is sufficient alone. Together, they represent the most sophisticated and ecologically grounded response to an invasive species crisis that has ever been attempted in the American Southeast. What Florida's experience ultimately teaches us is something that ecologists have understood for decades but that the public rarely appreciates in real time. Complex ecological problems require complex, patient, systemic solutions. The instinct to mock an unconventional approach is human and understandable. But the history of conservation is full of moments when the counterintuitive answer turned out to be correct. The reintroduction of gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park in 1995 triggered what ecologists call a trophic cascade, a chain reaction of ecological changes that altered river courses, restored vegetation, and increased biodiversity in ways that no one fully predicted. The recovery of the bald eagle population after the banning of DDT demonstrated that ecosystems can rebound from near total collapse if the right conditions are restored. The eastern indigo snake is Florida's version of that story, still unfolding, still uncertain in its ultimate scope, but already more successful than most people thought possible. The world laughed at Florida for releasing snake-killing creatures into a land overrun with snakes. The laughter has grown quieter with every hatchling photographed in the wild, with every python consumed by a predator that was never supposed to survive long enough to hunt again. The truth is not just that the plan is working. The truth is that it was the right plan all along, built not on desperation but on science, patience, and a profound respect for what nature, given the chance, is capable of doing on its own.